Charles Moskowitz here. Thanks for joining me, everybody. I was listening to an interview with Tom Hartman, who's a very prominent left-wing radio host, with David Pakman, who is a liberal YouTube host. And Tom is talking about his new book, which the title escapes me right now, but it deals with voter fraud. And I'm going to be doing a whole series of comments based on that interview because I think it gives a very good insight into the leftist mind and the leftist spirit. Basically, the book starts out, and Tom started out by talking about the history of American suppression of voting, that we were founded by a clique of white privileged landowners and that nobody else had the right to vote, and all of the other things that basically accurately presented the origins of the American Republic. But I'm thinking, this is a very malevolent presentation on his part and typical of the left. Yes, they'll take out facts, but they will put them in the most negative light and the most anti-American light possible, and not look at the broader question of what was going on at that time in our culture. Now, I've been learning from studying sociology that the good sociologist engages in what's called sociological imagination. It's a term that was coined by C. Wright Mills, where you look at both history and the current day. You look at the society as a whole, and you look at individuals in the society. You look at all contexts possible to develop social theory. The left tends to just look at a very narrow sliver in order to develop a malevolent social theory because they have an agenda. And in this case, and I think generally in all cases, philosophically at least, that agenda is to tear down America because America is free and capitalist, and that they have some demented idea of a authoritarian utopia where man is transformed. But let's get back to what Mr. Hartman was saying. Yes, indeed, that those things are technically true, but what's not mentioned in the broader context is that America was establishing a republic which was vastly different philosophically and otherwise from any nation that existed in the world at that time. Now, there had been experiments in the past with republics. Even the Romans experimented with a republic, and there were other brief experiments, but they didn't last. They would eventually devolve into authoritarianism and royalty and the ideas that basically were prominent in Europe at that time, which is the divine right of kings. That principle was that all rights come from the state, that the king grants rights as privileges and on a whim. And that idea contradicted the American founding principle, which is that rights come from God, the creator, as Jefferson said, not from the state, and that as such, we grant, as images of God, as those who possess natural rights, a limited grant of power to a government to protect those rights. That's the very embodiment of our Declaration of Independence, and our Constitution was the implementation of that, as imperfect as those things were. And that this was a complete contrast to what was going on in the rest of the world. Now, the fact that it was only white landowning males who got the enfranchisement in the first place, yeah, that's true, but I think that we need to say that we could look, and maybe this is a conservative thing, to tend to look at things as a glass half full, not as a glass half empty. The fact is that was a whole lot more people enfranchised than anywhere else in the world at that time, where the only people who were enfranchised in Great Britain and in Europe and in Africa and in Asia and certainly probably in the rest of the world were the king. and a small clique of people that surrounded the king. An aristocracy, people who had been given power by fiat, and who then would give little bits of power to their friends, and who would deny that power to their enemies because they had a right to do that. They assumed that they didn't have the right, they assumed the right to do that. So to my way of thinking, the fact that this country understood and recognized the natural rights of a very large segment of the population, that being white landowners, was progress toward the eventual further enfranchisement of the citizen. It was progress in the context of its times, and in those times it was radical because it was, counter-revolutionary, I would argue. That's a bigger subject, but it was a reassertion or an assertion of the natural rights of the citizen under God. The left wants to do the opposite, which is the hypocrisy of the whole thing. He's there complaining about the fact that the enfranchisement was only granted to, white male landowners, but yet the left wants to deprive rights from everybody. They want to transfer those rights to an elite, not based upon their wealth necessarily, although they are in de facto sense the richest people in the world, but based upon their belief that they have some kind of an enlightened knowledge to control the rest of us. And yet the Constitution implements the Declaration's ideas that we as individuals have natural rights that come from God, and that those rights eventually would be expanded in America. Eventually all white men, regardless of property over a certain age, would have the right to vote and would have the right to citizenship. That would be expanded to African Americans after the horrible Civil War, eventually to women after the right to vote, 1919, and it took time. It took time, and it evolved along with greater awareness of the importance of such rights, and that's something that occurred in America. So their view is a dark, malevolent view. Technically true, and you notice this with leftists anyways. To make their argument, they'll pull facts out of the air that are true and that you can't argue against because technically they are true. But they have no context in terms of what's going on in the society that they're discussing, and they're agenda-driven. And in the case of the left, don't doubt that agenda is anti-American and anti-human. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. Charles Moskowitz here. Have a great afternoon.